Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners from wherever you are around the world. Today is the start of 3 different shows where we're going to have some conservative guests on. Today is Matt K. Lewis, Daily Beast columnist and host of Matt Lewis and the News podcast, which you can check out down below in our show notes. The next podcast we'll have is Michael Strain of AEI talking about the debt limit. And then finally, we have Chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Congressman Bruce Westerman, coming up in February. So to start us off, first, Matt, we'd like to thank you very much for taking some time out of your afternoon. The NFL playoffs are going on, for joining us. So how are things over in West Virginia today?
Things are great here. I'm watching the game and it's snowing there. It's sort of rainy here. So it's kind of, dare say, romantic. I don't know. It's cozy. Cozy is the word maybe I would use.
It is, and John and I are from New Hampshire, so we absolutely love the snow. At least I love the snow, and I'm looking at this game, or I was, and it's gorgeous in Buffalo, and the team I'm rooting for is winning, so no complaints on my end, Matt.
There's nothing better than snow in a football game.
I wanted to kind of get right into it, Matt, because we just saw a speaker fight. We're going to have a debt limit fight, and everybody's branding themselves as a conservative, from Matt Gaetz to Marjorie Taylor Greene and to really Kevin McCarthy and everybody else involved. Can you give us your definition of what it actually means to be a conservative?
So I wrote a book in 2015. It came out in 2016 called Too Dumb to Fail. And when I wrote that book, I got asked this question a lot. And I had an answer, but I've had to kind of revise it because, words evolve. I think that American conservatism, at least, is about conserving the American ideas of the American Revolution. And that would be liberal democracy. So conserving liberal democracy to me would be conservative. But I do think that there's a battle over what it means to be a conservative. And I think that in different parts of the world, obviously, being a conservative means different things. It's a relative term. And I will say that I have taken to calling, I've tried to stop myself from calling people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz conservatives and started calling them the right or right-wingers and I don't even mean that to be pejorative. I just think it's a more accurate or specific way, and it doesn't confuse them with what I am, which is I would believe that I am a conservative. I think that maybe Yuval Levin wrote this really good book maybe 7 or 8 years ago called The Great Debate. And it was about Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine. And Burke, a lot of people consider Burke to be the first sort of modern conservative. And Burke believed in preserving institutions and in reform, whereas Thomas Paine believed in kind of radically overthrowing things and revolution. And if that's your definition, I would say that someone like yours truly, I'm conservative in the Burkean sense. And then someone like a Matt Gaetz or a Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think they're radical. They're not concerned about preserving institutions. They want to kind of burn it all down and reinvent the world as they see it. So I would call them sort of radical right-wingers but I guess and then I'll shut up. This is a huge question that you could do a book on this question.
Matt, I actually really like your response there that conservatism is about preserving the status quo or institutions or traditions within the context of any place. I mean, if we talked about conservatives in China today, we'd be talking about the people who are the most dedicated to Maoism and the ideology affiliated with that and the institutions of the CCP. And then, the radicals are the people who maybe want to bring things in a more market direction or a more liberal or open political direction. And it is kind of funny how conservatism and liberalism are sort of the centrist ideologies in the Western context. And I think people are starting to reclaim the way the word liberal is used to mean a kind of centrism, a dedication to capitalism and free markets, small L liberalism, which in many ways has actually been promoted more by the Republican Party in some of the recent decades. And now that the word neoliberal has kind of taken on that meaning, we've stopped using liberal as this synonym just for the left and more as the way it could appropriately be used as this kind of centrist ideology that more just has to do with openness, whether socially or economically. I think maybe the problem with conservatism is that the media aren't really yet making that same distinction that you were making, Matt. And it's less often about what these personalities are even saying about themselves and more about the words that the commentariat are putting on top of them. Something that I noticed was that Donald Trump, he never uses the word conservative. I don't recall him ever calling himself that, but it didn't stop many in the media from saying that he was an extreme conservative. And then with Matt Gaetz, I mean, it's a great example because, the issues we associate with him in his personal life, there's prostitution. And then in his public life, marijuana is one of the top issues that he pushes for. And I mean, that's not something that we really associate with conservatism. And I'm not sure he even uses the word that often. So is it really maybe more up to the media and commentators and people like you and to a lesser extent, maybe us, to just change the way that we're talking about these things so people use the right word?
I mean, it's not just Matt Gaetz either. It's look at Herschel Walker, look at Marjorie Taylor Greene's alleged lifestyle, look at George Santos's alleged lifestyle, look at Donald Trump's lifestyle, paying off porn stars, for example, not your father's conservatism. I do think some of it's semantics, and I do think that we in the commentary business need to become more precise. I'm sympathetic, though, because we had used these terms for a long, long time, and I'm sympathetic to the tendency to err and to sort of stick with them. But I do think that they've outlived their use. And I'll give you just an example that just occurred to me yesterday. Vox, the media outlet Vox, just had sort of layoffs. They fired a bunch of people. And there was someone on Vox, I'd never heard of her before. It was like an African-American young lady, as I recall, who tweeted out, basically, she's like, I'm not happy that I got laid off today, but I've been preparing for this the whole time I've worked at Vox. And the reason I've been doing that is that you should always be prepared. And so you should be working on growing your social media networking and updating your resume. And she basically went through, and this is a really cool, I tweeted it from at Matt K. Lewis, but this was a cool Twitter thread where this journalist, and I don't know her background, but I could only imagine that she's a left-leaning. Who knows? People might assume that about me. I'm a conservative, but I work at the Daily Beast, so I don't want to make assumptions, but I assume that she was left-leaning being at Vox, but she was laying out this thread about how, like, it's up to you to be prepared and to build networks and contacts and I've been squirreling away money just in case. And I almost tweeted like, this is a conservative instinct, or what she's saying here is a very conservative thing. And then it hit me like, actually, it's not, because you could argue that if conservatism's about community and tradition and taking care of people that are like you, then you would have a case where, like, these strong labor unions are making sure people could never be fired, that technology could never uproot you and fire you. And I was like, no, what she's advocating is individual responsibility. And that used to be synonymous with conservatism, but it's not necessarily tied to the right, at least. It's not. And so it's a long way of saying she was espousing this, I think, attitude that I thought was very positive and very productive and smart. And it used to be very consistent with what I would call mainstream conservative philosophy. And I almost tweeted that, and then I stopped myself and I was like, well, not exactly anymore. It's not so clear cut anymore, but it is self-reliance and individual responsibility. And those are things that conservatives used to believe in.
When we talk about how the Republican Party has personified a certain idea of conservatism historically, one of the examples that people look at is their attitude towards public spending, the debt, deficits, and so on. I'm wondering, for you, is that an important aspect of what attracted you to the idea of conservatism as we understand it, and to the Republican Party, at least in a previous phase in the GOP's history?
It was never something that animated me, to be honest with you. Maybe it's partly because I came of age during the Reagan years. Reagan had been sort of a green eye shade Republican in the 70s, but the thing that really made him attractive was supply side economics and a belief that you could kind of grow yourself out of debt. And Reagan really, during his presidency, talked about things like winning the Cold War, and he talked about being a shining city on a hill, and it was very inspirational. But during Reagan's time, the debt did increase. And so some people look at that as a failure of his, but it was never. So I would say that like the debt and the deficit were never kind of things that animated me or turned me on to politics. However, I would say that after Obama's presidency, people like Paul Ryan started warning all of a sudden, and in a way it was kind of a non sequitur in hindsight, but I really took them seriously and I took them at their word. And it does make sense to me that at a certain point it becomes unsustainable to keep having higher and higher debt and deficits. It seems certainly plausible to me that something bad could come from that, like inflation, for example. But then we all know what happens. The conservative movement and the Republican Party went a different direction. Instead of doing entitlement reform, for example, they went with Donald Trump. And I watched as all of these so-called Club for Growth, Tea Party, Freedom Caucus people voted for trillions of dollars in spending. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, I still think it's important for us to sort of get the debt under control. It's never been the kind of thing that like turns me on or excites me or motivates me. I just think it's something we have to do out of our responsibility. But I also think it's really kind of scummy and convenient that these Republicans are now all of a sudden, now that we have a Democrat president again, are coming back to that fight, to that cause. So it's like a long way of saying, I think it's a legitimate issue. It's never been the issue that inspired me or motivated me. And I think Republicans have really lost a lot of credibility on the issue because of what we've all seen in the last decade.
So you just took it in the direction that we wanted to go, right? And you clearly articulated that when there's a Democrat president, spending is bad. When there's a Republican president, it's probably pretty good if you're a conservative and you claim to be a deficit hawk. So following up on that, we're about to have a potential, it looks like, a debt limit fight that could be have severe economic consequences. And if you are a conservative or Joe Manchin Democrat, for example, like myself, you care about America's standing in the world. You want cheaper goods. You want a stronger military, and the debt default could throw all of that into flux. But I guess the more interesting approach to this question, Matt, is how much of this is politics as usual, where politicians, this time in the GOP, are saying one thing and tend to do another thing when it's in their interest, and how much of this is really unique to the GOP. So are Democrats as hypocritical, for example, on issues like the Republicans are the debt?
I believe the Democrats were a worse political party, and now I believe the Republicans are a worse political party. They're both bad. They're both hypocritical. They both do bad things that are self-interested, but I think the Democrats are just more sane, more competent today. I actually still agree with Republicans more philosophically than I do with Democrats, but I think that Democrats are just a more competent, responsible party today with the low standard that they are politicians and that all politicians are politicians. Look, so I think the problem with the debt is that the only way that so Democrats don't really want to, they're not focused or that concerned about the debt or the deficit. Republicans are the party that is concerned about it. The problem is that what they do is, rather than trying to change spending when they have power, because when you have the presidency and when you have all the levers of power, you don't want to cut spending because it's unpopular. You want to spend because people like that. It will help you get reelected. Donald Trump wasn't wrong politically when he said, like, we're not going to cut entitlements, because that is unpopular. The American people want pork. They want you to spend money on Social Security or whatever. And they don't want to confront that there's a real problem. So when Republicans have the power to actually do something about it, they won't, for political reasons. Then when Republicans don't have the power, they engage in this brinkmanship where instead of being able to cut spending while they're spending the money, they wait until the credit card bill comes due. And then they say, we're not going to pay. And I think that's really irresponsible and dangerous. So it's a really bad scenario. And I also don't see how we ever are going to actually do anything about spending until we really, really have to.
Matt, I need to ask you for a little bit of elaboration here, because you said it used to be that the Democrats were the worst political party. They were a bad political party, and now the Republicans are a worse political party and a bad political party. And you expounded on a little bit of why you think the Republicans are a bad and worse political party that has to do with just the competent approach to governance and paying the bills. But when you mentioned that about the Democrats, I wanted to hear a little bit more about what you were thinking. Like, does it have to do with that hypocrisy matter that you mentioned before, and in what regards? Or do you believe that the Democrats used to be less responsible and about that competent approach to government? I mean, tell us a little bit about that. At what point did you think the Democrats were worse? And tell us a little bit about why.
Yeah, so I would say that some of this could be like a Rorschach test for me. I mean, it could be that I was a kind of a partisan Republican, a partisan conservative Republican, and until Trump came along, I probably gave Republicans the benefit of the doubt, and my perception of Democrats as being evil and corrupt and also simultaneously incompetent. That may be like confirmation bias. I might have been seeing what I was expecting to see, but I also think things have changed. I mean, when you're comparing like Ronald Reagan, who I think was a great president, George W. Bush, who I think obviously made mistakes, but was a decent, good man, to today, to today's Republican Party, clearly some changes have happened. Clearly some things have changed. So I looked at a Democratic Party so I'm pro-life, so that was always a big issue for me. So I looked at a Democratic Party who was pro-choice, and immediately that cast them as the villains in my narrative. So that's one thing. But they also just seem to do things like, I can't even remember the details now. I'd have to look this up. It's a great thing about being a writer. You can Google things and get your facts correct, and people think you know what you're talking about because they're only seeing the final draft. But I remember there was a case, I think it was a race in New Jersey like 15 or 20 years ago, like a Senate race in New Jersey. And there was a scandal that hit the Democratic candidate right before the election. So they just got rid of him and they brought in a different candidate who won the race. And maybe that violated the actual law that was on the books at the time. But like my perception was that the Democrats were like very playing kind of hardball machine kind of politics, whereas the Republicans, it used to be, I forget, this is an old expression, but Democrats were the evil party, Republicans were the stupid party. And it seemed to be to me, and again, some of this might just be my perception, but for a long time, it seemed to me that the Republicans I knew and the conservatives I knew were really like good, God-fearing people, or like Alex P. Keaton, sort of Chamber of Commerce Republicans. And, the Democrats were like the party of pornographers and union bosses and Hollywood elites and rock stars and pot smoking hippies. Like that's the world I grew up in. And so some of it's probably just a generational thing, but it kind of started to change around 2016.
I think that sometimes it is that some of those individual people actually switch who they're voting for to an extent that is underappreciated. When you're talking about the sorts of Democrats that used to bother you, I kind of empathize with you, because for me, something I've always been really offended by are conspiracy theories, especially about September 11th. My family member was killed. I lived in the Middle East for 8 years after that. I heard so many conspiracy theories about 9/11 that really offended me personally. And when I met Americans who believed in 9/11 conspiracy theories, I knew that I wanted to be on the other side of that issue. So during the George W. Bush presidency, it was usually on the left that you would encounter that kind of stuff. The Michael Moores, Cindy Shaheen, I think her name was, some of those sorts of characters. And there's a certain aesthetic, a certain geographical, demographic aspect of the profile of that person. And I've noticed that today, those people, like not just even a way of thinking, but often the same individual people are now with the Republicans. They've actually switched parties and started voting for other people, the cranks. And I think the anti-vax movement was a way in which some people moved from one side to the other who fit into that community. I think that a lot of the conspiracy theories that Donald Trump loved promoting about law enforcement, about the U.S. civil service, about the U.S. military, he would go out and blame the United States for terrorist attacks and say it was Bush's fault 9/11 happened, it was Obama who created Daesh, this kind of stuff. And some of those same actual people went from one side to the other. I mean, that includes well-known people like Russell Brand or Glenn Greenwald. It really is not just a matter of getting annoyed by different people, but it's actually the same individual people that have switched sides.
Let me just say, John, you put it better than me. You literally made the point that I was trying to make in a much more coherent way than I did. So I think you nailed it, and you've really captured my feeling, and it is exactly what you just said, and then it's also 10 years because you're younger than me. It's the same phenomenon you're discussing it's even happened longer, but you nailed it. Totally right.
So this brings us to the media. Years ago, you were a young up-and-coming blogger. You wrote on McCain's bus, which was a big thing back then. And you were the future face of conservative media. And now blogging, it feels like, has turned into podcasting, where this is the new medium that we're looking at. Now you're more of a veteran. You've kind of seen it all, going from blogging to traditional media to now podcasting. I think that starting with the tiff between the Daily Wire and Crowder is an interesting place because it's both something that's happening now, Matt, but also maybe we can use it to frame our view of this wing of the conservative media. So can you kind of explain your thoughts on this argument and if it reveals anything about the harder right wing of the media ecosystem?
Yeah. So I guess first of all, let me say, be careful, guys, because you mentioned how I used to be a young up and coming blogger and how I'm more of a veteran now, but no one tells you when it's changed. There wasn't a day where like, okay, I'm no longer a young up and coming blogger anymore. Now I'm a middle-aged guy. Like there isn't a date that happens, and no one, like, it just sort of happens, but there's no, nobody tells you, you don't get a letter in the mail informing you. So just be careful. It'll sneak up on you. It happens. I miss blogging. It was fun. Blogging was fun. You'd be like, hey, check out what Justin wrote earlier today. And I'd link to it. And then I'd say, but I disagree. Here's where I think. Then I would do like a huge block quote of you. This is the most important paragraph right here. And then I would say, here's what I think he's right about points 1 and 2. But on point 3, I think that Ala Pundit, let me link to Ala Pundit, said it better. That was like super fun. And it was a conversation, and that's gone now. I do think podcasting is maybe the most fun medium now. And there's not as much of the give and take, and you can't really link to people in the same way. But I do think it still has the same ethos that's sort of fun and adventurous, and we're sort of pioneers. So I love that. To your point about what's happening now, right? So like my understanding is that Daily Wire like offered $50 million. Is that right? And it was not only rebuffed, but I'm blanking on his name. Who's the guy worth $50 million?
Well, he potentially was worth $50 million. Steven Crowder.
Steven Crowder. Okay. So Crowder was sort of offended by this, right? And went on his sort of YouTube channel and criticized, like outed them, criticized it. I think my take on it is there's a lot that could be said about this. I'll just give you one take on it. I think that Ben Shapiro is very smart, obviously. And I think he's, in terms of the conservative media machine, whatever we want to call it, I think he's, of the people in the conservative, media complex, I think he's one of the more decent, good people. But this is someone who like pays Candace Owens, and Steven Crowder, I don't think is in that league. But as I recall, he, kind of defended Kanye at some point over the anti-Semitic comments. I think it's a little weird that a guy like Ben Shapiro, who's like, I think Orthodox Jewish, not only Jewish, but like religious and observant. And like I said, super smart and seems to be a pretty good actor certainly compared to like Milo Yiannopoulos, who mocked him, for many years at Breitbart. That the fact that he is like paying these folks, I think it's a sign that this is what sells. That that even someone who is capable of, engaging in all sorts of like thoughtful, esoteric concepts and writes books, all the time and is very intelligent, is hiring people who are kind of playing this kind of politics, or at least dabbling in it. I think it tells you a lot about where the right is today and what kind of things are selling and getting clicks and getting views.
So to follow up on that, the pointed question is, how much are folks like Steven Crowder, who I don't listen to, but I've seen clips of Matt Walsh, who is with Ben Shapiro. He said some really misogynistic and gross things about women, right? Just taking that, never mind your views on other topics that he, I would argue, is pretty gross on. Tucker Carlson, for example, he says some pretty extreme things. His latest kick was how nicotine frees the mind, which I've heard marijuana frees the mind. I haven't heard that one yet. I was pretty shocked. And that's the question, though. You said this is where the business model is. For these folks, are they actors driven by the business model? Or is there some sincerity in these very extreme views? And how should we approach trying to understand the difference? And does it even matter if they're acting or they're sincere?
Well, I definitely think that Ben Shapiro is a conservative. This is someone who was a conservative when it wasn't cool. He was like writing columns for townhall.com when he was like 14 years old. Not the coolest thing in the world to be a young Republican or a young conservative. And yes, he monetized it, but he could have made a lot of money in a lot of other fields. I think he is clearly someone who is truly a conservative. The other folks, I think, kind of just wanted to be famous. And politics is now becoming a really good way, especially after Trump, that you can get an audience. And if you're a comedian, maybe you could make it as a comedian, maybe you couldn't. But if you throw in like, well, I'm also a conservative comedian. Well, okay, now it's more of a market niche, I would think. So I think that a lot of the people now are not Tucker. So Tucker, I worked for Tucker at the Daily Caller for 6 years. That's someone who I think is very smart and truly has political beliefs and loves ideas, loves politics. I obviously don't always agree with him these days, but I think that that's someone who is very political and very interesting. So I think it is a spectrum. But I would say a lot of the people today in the right-wing media, world are people who kind of they're not deeply rooted in any beliefs or philosophy. I think they're there to kind of make money and get famous.
Matt, I think that maybe my view of Shapiro's value as a commentator might be a little bit different from yours. I've found him to be sort of an adolescent thinker. You talked about how he was writing political columns when he was a teenager. And I imagine that, among his age group, he was quite an advanced thinker. But I wonder how much his way of thinking really developed from there, or if starting so young maybe stunted his growth and development as a thinker, because I found to be one of these people that reminds you really kind of the way a teenager or college student might approach political discourse, where everything really has to be all the way one way or all the way the other. And it's declarative statements with no room for nuance. So he's clearly very influenced by partisanship. But one thing that I did think that he really cared about very sincerely was the anti-Semitism issue. Just like you were saying, we want to talk to you about this because it's one of the more alarming trends on the right. At some level, it seems like prejudice is a little bit more just a mood and an aesthetic for the right. They kind of forgotten about some of the prejudices that they were pushing just a few years ago so strongly, like about Islam, about Spanish speakers that now have almost been completely dropped and replaced by law enforcement or federal agents that are now the target of the same kind of venom that they were putting at minority groups in the US. But with the anti-Semitism thing, it's a little bit different because this has always been kind of this concerning underbelly of the extreme right throughout history. So when it does resurface as it is now, it's a matter of so much concern. And, I believe that Shapiro really cared very sincerely about this issue. and seeing the tolerance that he has for Owens, for Crowder, his company offering Crowder tens of millions of dollars after Crowder had been recorded saying things about Jewish people. I mean, it really has to put into question the level of sincerity that he has on even the one topic that we had a feeling mattered to him the most.
Yeah. Do you know? I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. I invoked the Crowder said something about Kanye, but I don't remember specifically. Do you remember what it was that he said that? Because I don't want to lump him in, with Candace Owens, like undeservedly.
I don't have a direct quote. Maybe Justin can find it. We could try to find it. But I did hear a video clip or an audio clip of him saying something about it's true that in Hollywood, people with Jewish surnames are exploiting people. So it was something along those lines.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You just jogged my memory.
It would be a red line for that group that have now offered him tens of millions of dollars. It's kind of alarming to see. And if on the issue that we assumed was maybe the one issue that they cared about sincerely, that, we can see that perhaps they don't. It really draws into question how sincere they are about just about anything, right?
Yeah, I don't get it. I'm very curious about this. The only thing that makes sense is that this is where the right is gone. And if you want to be relevant on the right, and if you want to make money as a media outlet, then this is the way to go. Not to say that you have to be anti-Semitic to make money, but these are the types of people who are getting the views and getting the likes and the downloads or whatever that generate profit for media outlets. But I think it's weird. I don't get it.
Just to follow on to this thread, and I'm using Alex Jones, and I do not expect you to be an expert on things that Alex Jones has said. Neither am I. But
I had dinner with him. One time, but I've never. I listened to him when he had. I'm trying to think of who the guest was. I've listened to one or two Alex Jones podcasts in my life.
How was the dinner?
It was amazing.
Really?
It was amazing. I get every once in a while people who try to they'll try to kind of undermine my credibility. There's a picture of me, my friend Jamie Weinstein, Roger Stone, and Alex Jones. And there's a picture of us all having dinner together in Cleveland at the Republican convention. And every once in a while, people who want to kind of undermine my credibility and make it look like I'm a evil right winger will tweet that picture. And I say, the reason you have that picture is I wrote a column about it attacking Alex Jones at the Daily Beast. But fine, use that picture. The dinner was great. It was if you are someone who is a political columnist who covers the right and is curious, intellectually curious, and you have a chance to hang out with Alex Jones and Roger Stone, you don't say no to that. It was off the hook, crazy time. I apologize for nothing, but but I did go write a negative. I did write a negative piece about him, and I think deservedly. The only insight I got from the night, I wish I was able to glean more, but the only insight I got from the night was that Jones, and keep in mind, this is before he did a whole bunch of bad things. So I'm not suggesting that he had some sort of self-discovery, introspective epiphany, but he did say during our dinner that he had realized that he's become famous to the point where he has to be careful what he says because his words have consequences and he's had to rein himself in. Now, then he went on to say a million crazy things after that on the air. But at least that night, he acknowledged that with great power comes great responsibility.
It was proven that, the dangers of saying anything when you're Alex Jones because of the settlement that he had in Connecticut. Right?
Yep.
I mean, that just proves that, we were talking about the cranks that drifted from the left to the right. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, but Alex Jones is actually an example of that. He used to hang out with Richard Linklater in Austin. And Richard Linklater, the great filmmaker of School of Rock and the Before series, Dazed and Confused, he put Boyhood, he put Alex Jones in movies. He put him in Waking Life, maybe one more. People confronted Linklater about this, and they're like, how could you platform and promote this horrible person? He said, are you kidding me? This was during the Bush years. And the only thing Alex Jones was talking about was about 9/11 being an inside job. And I thought he was great. I thought he was a leftist like us. At the time, Alex Jones was perceived that way. And it changed, when we're talking about what it means to be on the left, on the right, what it means to be liberal, conservative, and so on, radical. I mean, Jones is a great example because he maybe didn't even really move that much.
And neither did I. That's why I didn't like people like Alex Jones then, and I don't like him now. And he and I probably haven't changed that much, but the whole rest of the world has. But that's a perfectly good point. You're absolutely right.
I wanted to get into how the media that we've been talking about has shaped the Republican Party. It sure shaped, Matt, the Republican Party that I grew up in. I think a year and a half out of college, I switched over to be a policy advisor for a member of the House Freedom Caucus. And it was very clear when we were debating Trade Promotion Authority, or TPP for our listeners, big trade deals, which were globalism. My boss generally was supportive of these deals, and he wasn't asking for takes on the policy. He was saying, Justin, you're my policy guy. You're smart. I need talking points. I need arguments that resonate with, at the time, Rush Limbaugh. It was totally, and I was a policy advisor, right? I'm not a communications guy. Everything that we were doing to support a legislation or oppose a legislation was driven by the media, the right wing, hardcore ecosystem that we're talking about. I don't want to say conservative because we started our conversation off on how we're defining that, but very obviously it impacted the Tea Party. It drove Trump. And I would argue that it's driving a lot of the House Freedom Caucus now, whether it be fights with McCarthy, fights over the debt limit, future fights over the budget. And it's not really the policy that is driving these folks. So considering that ultimately it feels like at least a portion of the party is beholden to this type of extreme rhetoric, and they're making their governing decisions off of that, how would you characterize the current state of the GOP as a whole, considering the outsized influence that this wing has?
It's a failed state. It's a disaster. And it is very related to what you're talking about with the media. I mean, I am old enough to remember when there were 3 TV channels, essentially, 3 networks, and then Fox came along, not Fox News, Fox, Married with Children, 21 Jump Street. It was a big deal, The Simpsons. And there was a liberal media monopoly. Now, they weren't left-wing, but they certainly skewed Democratic. They skewed liberal. And then I was a huge Rush Limbaugh. I remember when Rush Limbaugh came along, I was a huge Rush Limbaugh fan. So I'm someone who, I believe that liberal media bias was and is a major problem. And I was cheering on alternative conservative media outlets, which at the time seemed to be super harmless because we were like David versus Goliath, you know, as recently as maybe 10 years ago, the best we could hope for was to make a big enough stink to drive a story into the media, right? So like Monica Lewinsky as an example, and that's late 90s, but still not that long ago, you know, if you can make a big enough deal with like the Drudge Report or something, and the media has to cover it, but still, it doesn't matter unless they feel like they're shamed into covering it. They have to cover it. And then what happened is we reached some sort of a tipping point where enough Americans totally tuned out mainstream media. They cut the cords or whatever. And again, I think part of this is because of liberal media bias, and some of it's just because the technology allowed it. But at a certain point, instead of Rush Limbaugh being something you listen to 3 hours a day, but then you watch Tom Brokaw, it was just redstate.com and, or even worse, Breitbart, right? And Fox News all day long. And, you know, then you had like podcasts and now we're at a point where if you're a person on the right, you can go all day without really encountering diverse viewpoints. We talked earlier, we were talking about Ben Shapiro, John, about how Ben Shapiro started writing at the age of 14 and he's very declarative. And I think that really works. Like from an audience standpoint, I think that if someone is nuanced and maybe this is sort of true, like that's not compelling. What's really compelling is someone who knows. My experience was different for whatever reason. I always wanted to be like a Fox News guy. I was doing all the shows. Like when I worked at townhall.com, I would do Fox, but I would also do CNN and I would also do MSNBC. But I really caught on at MSNBC. And so I would go on and I would like make a conservative point, and then someone would push back and I'd be like, oh, fuck. I didn't say this, but I was like, I didn't think about that. And what happened is those people, they didn't make me liberal because my views were always based on sort of a deep abiding philosophy. But what I had to do was, I have to either say it in a better way, or I have to like research. And a lot of times what I would do is I would research and I really had to know it. It was on Fox News, I wouldn't have had to research. I would have said it and it would have stuck. But here, like I make an argument, someone pushes back, and I don't have the intellectual depth to be able to sort of counter that. And so now I have to really look into it. I have to read about it. I have to ask smart people about it. And it didn't turn me into a liberal, but it sort of changed me. I was like, oh, let me explain why this is actually right now. Liberals have a point on A. They have a little bit of a point on A, but really on B and C, we're right. And that process, I think, made me a better person. It gave me wisdom, and it made me unsuited to being a right-wing commentator. It ruined my career as a right-wing commentator because that's not helpful. And actually, I was a better, not just right-wing, I was just a better political commentator when I knew less stuff. Knowing more actually hurt me. But there is, they talk about the zealotry of the convert. There is something appealing about someone who just puts on the blinders and just makes these hardcore arguments. But the thing is, you can't get away with it. You can't get away with doing that in an adversarial environment where you're possibly outnumbered or certainly going to be challenged by the host. But if you are in a cocoon where like it's a podcast, you're the host, and you only invite people on who agree with you or patsies you can defeat, you will never encounter that adversity that will force you to do the research that I have done, or in some cases change. And so you never change, you never grow, but you keep getting rewarded for being adamant. And so it's a long diatribe, but that sort of explains why I became who I am and why I'm not making $50 million a year.
You did just hit on a lot of points, and you pulled a lot of strings together, Matt, in a great way that leads us to how does the GOP fix itself, right? So you just described we have all of these extremists and people are in their information bubbles. So they're not getting different feedback from different people with different points of view. So there's a tendency for them to double down. And then there's a tendency for the audience to also eat that up. And then there's this feedback loop that makes it more extreme. And the only way you're going to retain that audience and build a new audience is to keep going further and further and further and saying things that are more shocking because you got to compete with now everybody else, Jordan Peterson and Steven Crowder and all these other folks. So if you're in the GOP and you are beholden to these type of media folks, and your party and your Speaker of the House, for example, is beholden to the House podcasters like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, is the only way to fix the GOP to basically go and advocate like what the Bulwark does, which is we need to burn this thing down to the ground. We need to vote Democrats, even though we're pro-life. We're going to vote for candidates that are pro-choice, because there is no healthy feedback loop. So the only way these people will listen and be shocked into taking a moral self-inventory, or at least an inventory about what wins and loses elections, is to get crushed a couple times? Or is there a different way?
Well, as a conservative, I've been trying to conserve the Republican Party and the conservative movement and hoping that there were ways that we could reform it. And the other option is a more radical approach, right? To burn it all down. That is a radical thing. And so that goes against who I am. And that is why I've not, even though I respect the Bulwark and I like a lot of, and I listen to the podcast a lot, I've not bought into that theory. And I don't necessarily know that I want to be complicit in that because, again, the Democrats believe a lot of things I don't believe. Having said that, I think we've probably all watched a football team that, like, maybe this team needs to lose 16 games so that we can get a first round draft pick, you know? Like there is a thing where that happens. And so I don't know if I need to necessarily root for it. You know, like if you're a diehard, I used to be a Redskins fan. If you were a diehard Redskins fan, you still probably root for them, but then you're like, well, maybe it's good that they lost this game because then they're going to get a better draft pick. So look, whether I'm rooting for it or complicit or not, it simply may be a fact that the Republican Party is like an alcoholic or a drug addict that will not change until they hit rock bottom. Now, if the drug addict is your son and you realize he could die in the process of hitting rock bottom, you try to help him. You try to, let's take him to rehab. I'll talk to him. Maybe you love your son. You want to stop him, but it may be actually that he has to hit rock bottom and that you're enabling him by not letting him, right? And so I think it's natural that people like me have tried to save the Republican Party from themselves for the good of the country and the party and the movement. That it's like you love your son, like let's put him into rehab, or let's have what do they call it? Like not a confrontation, but where you invite everybody over from the family to
an intervention.
That's it, an intervention. Spoken like someone who's organized one. But the truth is, sometimes they have to hit rock bottom. And it just may be that the Republican Party will not get help, will not do the right thing until they have to. I don't want to see what happens because it's going to get a lot worse. They're not going to hit rock bottom because they lost another president. It's going to take, they're going to, as Donald Trump said, they're going to have to go through some things. And here's the other problem. Even though I believe it's true that the Republican Party has won just one out of the last 6 or 7 popular votes, something like that.
I think it's 7.
They've lost something like 6 out of the last 7 popular votes, right? George W. Bush barely won the popular vote in 2004. Okay. Yeah. But despite that, the Republican Party has won just enough to keep them from having to admit that they have a problem. And I thought that was what the midterms were going to be, by the way. It turned out not to be so. But my sort of negative assumption was, oh, great, Republicans are going to do great in the midterms, and this is going to teach them that they're awesome and that they don't have to change anything. And that didn't turn out, but maybe they did win just enough. They won the House. And if you're clinging to some, addicts are delusional and they make up excuses. And so if you're clinging, maybe that keeps them in the game. It's going to have to get really ugly. And the good news so far has been that the Democratic Party, again, there are a lot of problems in the Democratic Party, but they've been somewhat responsible during this time when the Republican Party was falling apart. But how long will that last? What happens when we have Matt Gaetz's party and Ilhan Omar's party? And those are our 2 options.
I think that there is this paradox to big election losses. And that's that when you've got a big election loss, the people who actually lose their seats are the ones that are in competitive districts who are probably more moderate or pragmatic. So what you're left with is the husk, and the husk that you're left with are often the worst voices in the party. So how do you get out of that is you need to have institutional gatekeepers that are able to guide the party in the right direction who are not elected officials. The people who run the RNC or the donor networks and so on. And this is what Reince Priebus was trying to achieve with that famous growth and opportunity report called the Autopsy in 2013. But the people didn't listen to that. They rejected it. And I think part of the problem is, and I mean, you're drawing that contrast, Matt, between the Democrats and the Republicans, is that the Republican Party don't really like their old elites, whereas the Democratic Party trusts their elites. They like Biden and Obama and Pelosi. They trust them and they'll listen to their advice about what's pragmatic and sensible.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's ironic, again, sorry to interrupt you, but you keep making these good points. It's ironic because this goes back to your earlier point, right? It used to be that conservatives respected our elders and the wisdom of, I don't even know what to put it, but it was the left who were like, hey, man, the establishment on campus, man, they're trying to shut us down. It's always the establishment coming after us. It's like at some point, those things switched. And that is a change. We used to respect authority and they used to rail against the establishment. And like that has totally changed.
Well, I think maybe the culture of seniority inside the Democratic Party institutions is partly influenced by the CBC, right? Because the rules about seniority for chairmanships and all of that was like heavily promoted and pushed by the CBC.
Jim Clyburn is an elite who controls a block of votes in South Carolina. He controls a block of African-American votes, and they will defer by and large to him as kind of a boss. And as much as I used to hate that kind of thing, that's also called leadership. And it's also called, it's local, it's not national. They're not going to MSNBC. They're going to what does our local pastor say? What does our local congressman say? And so I think that insulated the Democratic Party from this populist takeover that ironically hit the Republican Party.
Yeah, you see this kind of pragmatism and also that kind of respect and genuine affection for the senior figures in the party that you don't see on the GOP side. And, when Clyburn says we need to vote for Biden because that's the pragmatic electoral choice, a lot of people actually listen, whereas they don't listen to Priebus. And now they have a party leadership that doesn't even want to suggest pragmatism because their leaders are people. I mean, this is not correct on this kind of Senate side of the picture with McConnell, who is more of a Clyburn type. But on the House side, you've got McCarthy, who only knows the word yes, doesn't know the word no, and thinks that it can just be ice cream for everybody, tell the base exactly what they want. Hugely compounded by election conspiracy theories, because you're talking about how losing big helps you realize you need to change. If you don't admit that you lost, you never have to come to that realization and change course. And that's part of why it's so appealing, isn't it? Because if you can just deny that you actually lost the election, there's no need to change. No, we really won.
Yeah. But talk about a postmodern liberal idea that there is no abject truth, that hey man, you only lose if you think you lost. I hate to keep going here, but once again, this is an example of the world turned upside down.
You guys are making very deep points, and my mind just goes to witnessing what we're discussing in real time in the GOP when my boss was working with the other, I call them freaks and not affectionately, but Mick Mulvaney, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, to overthrow Boehner, because Boehner was trying to be that voice of reason back in 2015. We need to raise the debt limit. We need to fund the government. And ultimately what was happening and he was providing, in my opinion, true leadership. If you go back a little bit further, when these malcontents were acting up, he threw them off committees and he tried to rule with an iron fist. So I think that largely what happened was the right-wing media, the Rush Limbaughs, the Sean Hannitys, now the Tucker Carlsons, back in the day, they were feeding this insurrection type mentality, legal insurrection, poor choice of words, admittedly, from this right wing of the party. So there was no support really for John Boehner because Fox News started to agree with the more hardcore right wing aspect of things. And ultimately, what we have happened here is, you both were alluding to it, there is no leadership in the GOP, but I think it's largely because when there was a leader that tried to step up, ultimately he didn't get the support from the media. And these insurrectionists just continued working at it, browbeating him to having to retire. And the lessons learned by elected leaders in the House, the lessons learned by the folks in the media is that extremism sells for the folks in the media, and that also in Kevin McCarthy's case, for example, you're not going to become the Speaker of the House if you don't kowtow and totally bend the knee to these folks, because without the media, you're nothing to ultimately the GOP grassroots activists. So that's not a deep point.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that clearly what's happened is that the inmates are running the asylum. There really are no leaders, partly because the people who had an opportunity to be leaders were bad people, and partly because the carrots and sticks aren't there anymore. There is no institution like it used to be. If you got to be the head of the RNC, you would have had a certain amount of power automatically, and people would have had to have deferred to you and respect you, whether they wanted to or not. Same thing with being the Speaker of the House. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, raises a ton of money. In the olden days, if the Speaker of the House didn't like Marjorie Taylor Greene, she wouldn't have raised a dime or very little. And so I think that technology and other rule changes, McCain-Feingold, things like that, have eroded the ability of political parties and gatekeepers and elites. Sort of statutorily, they have less power. And then I think some of it has to do with character, whether you respect authority or not, whether you deserve to be a leader or not. There are certain people who have, by virtue of their past sacrifice or their experience, have earned a certain moral authority. Other people have not. But at the end of the day, we're in this horrible situation. And I think that essentially it's impossible now for someone, by virtue of obtaining a position like the Speaker of the House or the chair of the RNC, that does not bestow upon them any real power. And so what the only answer, I think, would be for someone to come along who is so charismatic that they can lead by sort of force of their personality. Donald Trump actually had that in the Republican Party, except he was inherently chaotic. And to the extent that he had this charisma, it was used for, we're lucky he wasn't more competent. I mean, he obviously has authoritarian tendencies, but luckily he was kind of chaotic and incompetent. But he actually could have, like, think of it this way. If Donald Trump had been a better person, but he had the Donald Trump power, but he was a better person, Donald Trump could have called up Matt Gaetz and been like, listen, this is over. We're not doing another ballot. Kevin McCarthy's the Speaker. He could have done that. So it is possible to have leaders, but I think that, where are they? Where's Ronald Reagan's not walking through that door. I don't know who. I don't see anybody on the horizon that is someone who has the power and the charisma. Maybe it's Ron DeSantis. I don't know.
I love you invoking Rick Pitino. And for the listeners,
you got the reference.
I did get the reference. The Celtics sucked. They hired this coach from Kentucky, this mad genius, and he sucked. And he got very angry at a press conference, and he looks at the audience of the media members and he goes, Larry Bird, the negativity in his town just sucks. Larry Bird is not walking through that door. Bill Russell, Robert Parrish. So I did get I really love that reference as a Boston sports fan.
I've used that in a few columns. And my son now plays for a local basketball team that are the Celtics. So it was I just came from a game, so it's top of mind.
Well, the Celtics are on a great streak now, but there was something else that you said, Matt, that my ears perked up at that I kind of wanted to respond to. And that was talking about how we're lucky that Trump was incompetent.
It's his hobby horse.
It's one of my favorite soapbox opportunities, but I think that this is a little bit misunderstood because, by looking at history and comparative politics and other countries, I think that people really underestimate how dangerous incompetence actually is. The idea that we were saved by an incompetent Trump, I think might be wrong. For example, during the pandemic, the last thing that we wanted was an incompetent leader. And the number of people that are going to suffer as a consequence of incompetence at moments like that is important and significant. And the things that people really need and want the most from their government is competence, because they rely on the government for public services, public safety, for a functioning economy. And so when you've got an incompetent leader, that can ruin your country. If you look at China under Mao, tens of millions of people died, as many or more than died during World War II. And it was less, I mean, there was malice at play, but the most suffering and the most death and destruction happened because of the Great Leap Forward, failed economic policy, failed agricultural policy that devastated and ruined the country.
I agree with you in one sense. I mean, Donald Trump could have accidentally started a nuclear war with North Korea and killed us all. That would have been incompetence, and it would have been very bad. But my major concern about Trump, and I don't want to sound paranoid or conspiratorial, but the biggest knock on Trump, in my opinion, was he tried to overturn the peaceful transfer of power by a coup that if he had been smarter, not just in the last hours, but for those 4 years, if he had been better at dealing with COVID, indeed, if you believe that Donald Trump, has authoritarian tendencies and is a demagogue, and that he tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power, then it stands to reason that if he had been smarter about doing it, it might have worked. And that's my concern. But, Jonah Goldberg has a funny line. He says, Hitler would have been able to overturn Obamacare. That's the line. So I guess that kind of puts it. I agree with you that incompetence is incredibly dangerous and has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, and often goes hand in hand with the kind of crazy people who become dictators. My point is, I think we were lucky that Trump wasn't more effective and more cunning in the way that he went about governing and then trying to incite a coup.
I definitely see what you mean. I mean, the thing that made him the most authoritarian, the trait that he had the most in common with authoritarians, was that incompetence. And just like you were kind of hinting, like the incompetent authoritarian puts family members in positions of power and toadies in positions of power. And that's part of why government functions don't really work in those systems. That was something that we saw a lot from him. And the corruption. Authoritarians don't necessarily want to run a poor country, but the countries they run often end up being poor because...
But I would say, again, I'll use my point with Hitler. I think we're lucky that Hitler wasn't more competent. I mean, if he hadn't been drug-addled, if he had been smart enough not to invade Russia or not to declare war on America, like, we're lucky that he wasn't more competent. And I think, not to compare Trump to Hitler, because again, Hitler would have been able to overturn Obamacare, but we're probably lucky that Trump also wasn't more competent. Like, the fact that these megalomaniacs also have judgment problems is probably a good thing in the long run.
Well, Matt, you're saying that we'll probably wind down in a second.
This is a total dorm room discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you're saying that we're lucky that he was so incompetent that he declared war on Russia. I mean, maybe in the strategic picture of winning the war, but I mean, tens of millions of people died because he invaded Russia, right? 30 million people in the Soviet Union died in the war. That incompetence led to so much suffering.
We talked a lot, Matt, about economic incentives and audience driving the extremism in the right-wing ecosystem. You're a conservative, you're Christian, you're pro-life. You write for the left-wing Daily Beast. Are you finding that the interests and expectations of your readership are changing the way you approach topics, or even the topics that you approach? And how do you try and balance the reader feedback with your deeply held philosophy that is why you are conservative?
This is something that I've always thought about. So I was at the Daily Caller for 6 years. And there, my role was to basically, so the Daily Caller, Tucker Carlson and Neil Patel founded it. I was there for 6 years, blogging still. So I was writing multiple times a day. But the audience there didn't like me. Because they were increasingly more populist, more Trumpy toward the end. And I was telling them, like, we need to do immigration reform. And they hated me. And so I saw my role there as being someone who kind of challenged their assumptions and tried to persuade where I could, and to persuade, like, let me explain to you why I think this is conservative. And then now I've been at the Daily Beast for 6 years. And I think that, I've got a couple of, ideally at a place like the Daily Beast, one of my roles would be explaining, and this is what I did so I used to work at AOL's Politics Daily during the Obama years. And my role was basically like, oh, this is what Republicans are saying. Let me explain to you why that's not bad. Let me explain to you what they really mean. They're not crazy. They're not evil. So that's ideally what not my role, but that would ideally be one of my functions now at the Daily Beast. Unfortunately, it's harder and harder to make that argument. And so those kind of pieces, although they still exist, are probably rarer than they used to be, because it's harder to kind of defend the Republicans. And there are occasions where I can do it on an issue. Like, let me explain to you why I'm pro-life. I did that several times in the Roe versus Wade run-up to overturning that. But it's really hard to defend any Republican politicians these days, or most of them. But I will sometimes criticize Biden, let's say. Like, I have a column, as we're talking, I have a column coming out tomorrow that's going to criticize Joe Biden. And it's basically going to say, Biden and Trump are more similar than you think. The most obvious recent example is the classified document scandal. And like, although there are some significant differences, we've got these two old politicians who both had classified documents that they shouldn't have. But then I go on to say, but there's another thing, and that's their families. And I don't know if you saw, this did not get much play, but like, there was a story just a few days ago where one of Joe Biden's brothers, Frank Biden, was he's on a video giving a speech where he's basically implying to the people he's speaking to that he's going to help get them funding because his brother Joey, because I'll give you my word as a Biden, that kind of thing. And this happens a lot with Biden. It's his brother James, it's brother Frank, it's son Hunter, and it's been going on for decades. And there's actually a lot written about this, even though it's not driving the news. And so that's my column. And so I do a lot of different things for the Daily Beast. But one of my roles is to write that column that I don't know if anyone else is going to, but I want to write the column dinging Joe Biden so that if you're a center-left person living in a major city, you're not going to be, in the cocoon. You're going to see a piece. Oh, here's this guy writing something critical about Biden. And, I read it and it's not BS. Like, this guy actually, and then the person might say, like, okay, so there's two types of people. Like, the intellectually honest person, I believe, will read this and say, oh, this is interesting. At first, I thought it might be BS, but this guy is right. He's got the goods. He's totally right. Now, it's not as bad as Trump, but he has a point. That's what I hope. But I'll get emails from some people and they'll say this: you're part of the problem. You're helping Donald Trump by writing this. And I reject that. My job is not to help Joe Biden or the Democrats. That is not my job. I don't posture myself as a straight reporter, but I am an opinion journalist, and my job is to give my opinion and as I see it, and to be intellectually honest about that. And I do think one of my functions is to point out hypocrisy or problems that Democrats are making, because they're not always going to get reported on or talked about by left-leaning columnists.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Matt.
This is a great podcast. You guys I feel like we could keep going, but we probably shouldn't. I wonder how the Bills are doing at this point.
They're about to lose and win me a good chunk of cash. So,
well, congratulations. I'm glad I didn't bet on it, because I would have lost money on this one.